Hi, my name is Scott Page. I received my training in mathematics and in economics, but over the past 10 years I've worked as a professor of complex systems at the University of Michigan. So people often ask me, what are complex systems? What is complexity? In this series of lectures, what we're going to do is we're going to take on this topic of complexity. We're going to ask, what is it? Why does it matter? Now, the word complex is tossed about in a variety of settings. So on television and in newspapers, you might hear pundits describe financial markets or international politics as being complex. Or you might pick up the science news and read that medical researchers discussing complex interactions involved in the folding of a protein. Or you might be out for dinner and a chef might use the word complexity to describe the bay scallops served with applewood bacon in a port reduction. But what do they mean exactly, and do they all mean the same thing? So, in brief, when we describe something as complex, what we're going to mean is that it consists of interdependent, diverse entities. And in addition, we're going to assume that those entities adapt, that they respond to their local and global environment in some way. So often it's going to be helpful to think of these entities arranged on a network or in some sort of space. So we've got this definition: diverse, interdependent, connected, adapting entities. And if we take that, we can see that yes, in fact, financial markets are complex. The banks, traders, government regulators are all connected in some sort of network. And their behaviors are interdependent. How one bank behaves depends on what other banks are doing. And it's also the case that these banks adapt. And unfortunately, in some cases, they all adapt in the same direction. We get bubbles and crashes. It's also true then that political systems are complex, right? How one country acts influences how another one does. Now, as for those bay scallops, well, they're close. There's not a lot of adaptation going on. But if they taste good enough, maybe we'll cut the chef a little slack. So complex systems interest us for a bunch of reasons. So first of all, they're often really unpredictable, and that's not a very good thing. Second of all, they often produce large events. We get crashes and wars, and that's also not a very good thing. But one good thing about complex systems is that they're remarkably robust. So complex systems can withstand unbelievable trauma and environmental variation, and yet still hold together. So we see this in ecosystems. They can lose a species, yet somehow maintain functionality. Perhaps most interesting, though, is that complex systems produce these what we call bottom-up emergent phenomena. So this is where what happens at the macro level differs in kind from what we see at the micro level. Consciousness is an example of emergence. We have individual neurons that are really very, very simple things. Yet we have a network of interdependent adapting neurons in our head that produce a conscious mind, personality. So this is amazing, right? Emergence takes many forms, including self-organization. So the next time we're in a city, just step back and watch the comings and goings of the people and delivery trucks and ideas and goods. And somehow it all works. Yet there's no central planner. The order of a city just emerges from the bottom up. So finally, when we look at a complex system, we see that they produce amazing novelty. We have toucans, sea slugs, laser printers, and hip-hop music. Who could have imagined any of these things? It's these reasons, unpredictability, large events, robustness, emergence, and novelty, that we find complex systems interesting from an intellectual perspective. Now, from a pragmatic perspective, we have no choice but to take an interest in complexity. Like it or not, these are complex times. We live with market volatility, industry failures, warnings of ecological destruction, and terrorist threats. And there's little or no sign of this complexity waning. So be it not a wish or a curse, but an inescapable reality, we live in complex times. So how do we make sense of them? In this first lecture, we're going to stick to the basics. So most of what I want to do is I want to convince you that rather than think of complexity as some vague term, that we can give it a precise definition. That'll allow us to say that one situation is more complex than another. Now remember, a complex system consists of these connected, interacting, diverse, adaptive entities: neurons, people, species, countries, firms. These parts are interdependent. It's this interdependency and this adaptation that produce the complexity that is both our blessing and our burden. Now, in this series of lectures, we want to learn about complexity theory. And we're going to see this sort of as a new paradigm, as a new way of thinking. Now, as often is the case, new paradigms bring with them new tools, right? And what we're going to see is that the new tools we use in this course are mostly computational. So in the past, science was typically done through mathematics. Now a lot of what we're going to see is computational tools put into play. In these lectures, we're going to move beyond metaphor, and we're going to introduce the science of complex systems. We're going to learn a whole new vocabulary: rugged landscapes, tipping points, positive feedbacks, emergence, self-organized criticality, and agent-based models. These are going to be new words that we learn, and we're going to use that vocabulary to make sense of the world. Now, courses in complex systems tend to take one of two forms. If they're taught by a physicist, the course tends to rely entirely on precise logical definitions, mathematical theorems, and formal models. If they're taught by a social scientist like me, or a journalist even, the course would rely on loose definitions, metaphors, and anecdotes. We're going to shoot for sort of a middle ground here. We're going to introduce formal definitions when needed, but we're not going to let the formalism bog us down. We're not going to let it get in the way of a deep conceptual understanding of the core insights. So to get that deep conceptual understanding, we're going to talk about anecdotes and historical events to give us a deeper understanding. So in this opening lecture, I've just got three goals. The first, we're going to learn what we mean by complexity science, to give us some formal definitions. The second is going to see why complexity is important, why it matters. And then third, and finally, I want to just give some glimpse of what's going to come throughout the series of this lecture, since most of us probably don't know really what complexity science is. So let's get to it. Let's go. What is a complex system? Again, it's a complex system capable of producing structures and patterns. And it's these high-level structures and patterns that just emerge from the bottom up that's sort of amazing. They're not built in. So life itself is an emergent phenomena. Complex systems don't settle into simple patterns, little periodic orbits like the Earth going around the sun. But instead, they're a source of constant novelty. And again, as I mentioned before, they're paradoxically both robust and susceptible to large events. So a small or moderate disturbance can have little or no impact, yet at the same time, a small grievance can escalate into a large war. For that reason, we're sometimes going to describe throughout this course complex systems as not normal. By that, I mean that outcomes don't fall on a standard normal distribution, the standard sort of bell curve that we see in statistics. But instead, they're distributed according to something called a power law. Now, a power law is a distribution where we get these very large events. I'll explain that later in much more detail in another lecture. What's interesting about complex systems, at least to me, is that they pulse with life. They're not in some sort of equilibrium. So we don't have supply equaling demand like an economist would think. Nor are they chaotic. But they occupy this strange place in between order on the one hand and chaos on the other. So let's dig deeper into our definition. We're going to define a complex system, or a system as diverse, as complex, if it consists of diverse agents who are connected, whose behaviors and actions are interdependent, and who adapt. These four parts, diverse, connected, interdependent, and adaptation, are the necessary parts for a complex system. So rather than just saying economies are complex, or ecosystems are complex, or the international political scene is complex, we can base those statements on logical foundations. So I want to take these one by one. An economy is diverse. It has diverse producers. There's McDonald's, there's Williams-Sonoma. An ecology has diverse parts. There's houseflies, squirrels, and in my backyard, there's rose-breasted grosbeaks. Both economies and ecosystems are also connected. So in an economy, firms are connected to suppliers in a supply network. Two grocery stores who are in the same town are also connected geographically. Or if I go online even, two water ski suppliers, they're connected virtually. So again, we've got all these connections in an economy. Now in ecology, species typically are connected by geography. Two species interact if they happen to be in the same location. Now these same species are what we call interdependent. And what I mean by this is nature red in tooth and claw. Species literally feed on one another. Now there's also interdependencies in an economy. Now at least on the surface, these seem a little bit less severe. There's no eating and being eaten. But there is competition. How one firm does determines how another one does. In the social realm, we also have interdependencies. Now these are more psychologically based. So how happy I am depends on how other people think about our choices. So if I'm wearing some purple Converse All-Stars, if people like them, I feel happy. If they don't like them, I feel a little less happy. All right, last but not least, adaptation and selection. Let's take a company like McDonald's. They offer salads. When they do this, they're adapting to a changing environment. Now markets also have selection. It wipes out poor performers. So witness the failure of Montgomery Ward or Oldsmobile. Ecosystems also feature this adaptation and selection. With even a crude observation of the world around us, we can see adaptation in practice. I lived in Palo Alto for a year, and acorns were scarce. So what happened was the squirrels started eating the soy-based electric wires in my car. That's adaptation. Selection in ecosystems is more difficult to see in real time, but the fossil record makes clear that those species that do not fit in, those that are not fit, don't survive. So now that we've got these four attributes, diversity, interdependence, connectedness, and adaptation, we can put some flesh on my earlier claim that the world is in fact becoming more complex. Let's compare our world today against that of an earlier time. 10,000 years ago, the Earth supported 5 to 10 million people. That's it. Those people were mostly concerned with survival. They weren't concerned with watching movies. They hunted animals, they gathered berries. As recent as 100 years ago, most of the world's population lived in rural areas and worked by farming or hunting and gathering. Now, farming is difficult work, don't get me wrong. You pick rocks in the spring, you plow fields, you plant, you milk and birth cows, etc. The average farmer, though, belonged to a community of people who looked like them. There wasn't much diversity. Those other farmers had similar skill sets. These farmers worked for the most part in isolation. Maybe once a year the farmer would head into town, once a month, to get sugar, cloth, sell some crops. So you've got not much diversity, not much interdependence, and not much adaptation. As the years passed the door on a typical farm, each one went roughly the same as the one before, right? You'd plant, weed, harvest. Yeah, there's variations in weather, but the key point here is the farmer planted beans and carrots. He got beans and carrots. Nothing unpredictable happened. Let's compare this to the modern world. Now, what most workers do is much more diverse. People live in cities, they're more connected. And in developed countries, they have incredibly diverse skills. Just look through the yellow pages. You find engineers, physicists, lawyers, psychologists, landscape architects, computer repair people, so on. These people are more connected as well. These connections are both physical, we live in closer proximity, right? And more work is also done in teams. So we have, and life is also virtual now. We have friends we connect to online and by phone. So we're just much more connected. It's also true that our actions are more interdependent. When we work in a group on projects or a team, the value of one person's contribution depends on the values of others. Whether we're making a movie, a piece of software, or a car, the success of that project depends on the coordinated actions of many people. So the farmer, right, the farmer of old, reaped what he sowed. The modern knowledge worker is only as good as the team that surrounds her and the context in which she finds herself. So we're much more interdependent. We're also more adaptive, right? I mean, new firms and technologies are constantly arriving. We have better and faster information. So prior to what's been called the information revolution, if you ran a large company, you would wait 6 to 9 months to see how sales are going. That's completely changed. Now firms get minute-by-minute updates. Let me give a very specific example. If you go into a major store like a Walmart and you buy milk, not only do they update their inventories, they can place new orders for more milk automatically if supply is warranted. So let's suppose you're in Peoria, Illinois, and you stop in and you put some milk in your cart and you walk through the checkout. It could very well be the case that a refrigerated truck driving down I-80 gets sent a message and just turns right back around and heads back to Peoria and restocks those shelves. It's been said of Walmart in particular that as soon as you place the milk in your cart, they call up the cow. Now, in painting this broad stroke picture of increasing complexity, right, especially the increased adaptation that we saw in the case of Walmart, 3 caveats are in order. First, the increase in diversity, connectedness, interdependency, and adaptivity doesn't mean that the world was not complex in the past. It was. It just wasn't as complex as the world is now. Second, this argument that I've just made for increased complexity, that doesn't make any value judgments about the past relative to today. I'm not saying that life in the past was boring. I'm not saying it was uninteresting. All I'm saying is that technological advances, increased population, have ramped up the attributes that contribute to complexity. Third, we may not even be saying that the world will keep getting more complex. We're going to talk about this in a later lecture. It's possible the world could become less complex. If we ramp up these attributes too much, if we become too interdependent, too connected, too diverse, we might lose complexity, and what we might get instead is some sort of collapse into what's really just an incomprehensible mangle. All right, These caveats notwithstanding, by almost any measure, the social, economic, and political worlds in which we live are more complex than they were a few hundred years ago. And they may be too complex for us to understand unless we develop some new ways of thinking. This is why I moved from economics into complex systems, because I felt the world was becoming more complex. Now, it's also true, I've been talking about the political and social and economic world, the physical, ecological, and biological worlds are also more complex. Now that seems impossible because physics and biology haven't changed. But think about it this way. Transportation has brought people and species in closer contact. So diseases, flora, and fauna now jump across physical space at speeds that were once impossible. We're also able to even manufacture new physical entities. So element 108, hassium, didn't exist until man created it. So we've got more things than we had in the past. In addition, we have finer lenses with which to see the world, and we're more aware of the complexity within us. This is especially true in biology. Right? We used to think that perhaps there was maybe a clean mapping from DNA to phenotype, right? From genotype to phenotype. But now we're much more aware that there's an incredibly complex process that involves RNA and epigenetic processes, things outside of genes, chemical processes. So the deeper we're able to look, the more complex the world around us and within us appears to be. Okay, at this point, I want to stop a second, take a time out, and make what I think is an incredibly important distinction. Complexity is not the same thing as complicated. So a watch, I have a watch in my wrist here. A watch is complicated, but it's not complex. So a watch has diverse parts, that's true. They're connected, and they're interdependent. But the key thing is those parts aren't adaptive, nor are they subject to selection. They're just mechanical parts that operate in a fixed manner. So a watch can't do the things that complex systems do. It's not unpredictable, it's very predictable. It doesn't create large events, there's no large events coming from my watch. And it's not robust. It won't withstand small disturbances. What do I mean by that? If I take off the back of this watch and pull out a part, it's going to break. That's because the other parts don't adapt. They're not going to fill in the gap, right, that's left when I pull this part out. Now that's not true of organizations, and this is what's so cool about complex systems. Suppose you miss a day of work, or I miss a day of work. You come back the next day and your fellow employees say, oh, how you feeling? Is everything okay? They might even say, boy, the sledding was tough without you, whatever, right? But the reality is the organization soldiered on without you just fine. And its robustness, the reason it could is because the parts, the people, were able to adapt. Now, robustness is just one property of complex systems. Let's consider some others. Now, in addition to being robust, complex systems are going to produce large events. When I say large events, I mean large events. I mean floods, earthquakes, hurricanes. I mean things like political upheavals, stock market crashes, traffic jams. And I even mean biological large events like epidemics. Because complex systems can produce these large events, as I said before, we're going to sometimes say that they're not normal. And again, what I mean by that is the distribution of event sizes is not our sort of standard normal bell curve. Instead, it's got what we call a long tail. So that means that there's these big events, and these big events have huge consequences. And this is the world wars, the floods, the stock market crashes that we really want to avoid. Now, this seems paradoxical, or it should seem paradoxical. On the one hand, complex systems are robust, and on the other hand, they're susceptible to these large events. And I want to argue that this isn't paradoxical. Stock markets can crash 20%. Cities can go underwater. And yet the economy, society can somehow muddle through. It's robust to these sort of shocks. Let me give a very specific example from my own life. So in the mid-1990s, I took my first job as a professor at Caltech in Pasadena, California. During my first year there, on January 17, 1994, at about 4:30 in the morning, I was shaken from my bed by what has been now called the Northridge earthquake. During this earthquake, the entire LA basin rattled and shook, and it seemed like minutes or half hour, but it was really just a few seconds. Now, the impact of this earthquake was substantial. 4 freeways were shut down because of bridges just collapsed. And if you looked at aerial shots from the news helicopters, it looked really much closer to strategic bombing than some sort of natural event. And yet, what's amazing is the Los Angeles economy survived with really just a small hiccup. How does it do it? How did it do it? Well, people adapted. They telecommuted. They worked on adjusted schedules. Some people left work early. Some people left late. people were able to adapt and make the system robust. Now, it should be clear why, from a purely pragmatic perspective, as intellectually interesting as these ideas are, why this sort of paradox of robustness in large events should be of great concern to us. If we could discern how to construct robust systems, organizations, political systems, ecosystems, we'll be better off. At the same time, if we can identify conditions that are ripe for these large events, then maybe we could head them off. Maybe we could stem the tide. We'd also be better off. Now, I don't want to in any way diminish these pragmatic considerations. I'm a social scientist and I'm sort of paid to be pragmatic. But they're really not the reason most people, including me, study complex systems. And the reason we study complex systems is really the mystery. And one great case of mystery is emergence. So what is emergence? Emergence, as I said before, is this distinction where the macro differs from the micro. So consciousness is the classic example of emergence. We'll talk about that quite a bit throughout this course as an example. Now, I want to step back and sort of do some baby steps here. Thomas Schelling, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, wrote a book called Micromotives and Macro Behavior. In this book, he worked through some examples. And in these examples, what happens at the macro level doesn't accord with what seems to be going on at the micro level. So let me give an example. Suppose you've got a bunch of people who are fairly racially tolerant and they're trying to decide where to live. What Schelling showed is that you'll end up with macro level segregation. So at the macro level, you get segregation, even though at the micro level, you've got a fairly high degree of tolerance. So this is a case where micro and macro disconnect writ large. Now, when we say they're disconnected, I'm not saying that the whole just differs from the parts. I want to say that it actually differs in kind. What do I mean by that? Well, look at a single water molecule. There's no way in which a single water molecule can be wet. Wetness is a property that happens sort of at the macro level. It's something new and wonderful that emerges when one water molecule is combined with others. If we want to have any hope of understanding how wetness or consciousness emerges, we've got to dig into the study of complex systems. A common form of emergence is something that's known as self-organization. So this occurs when we get some sort of spatial pattern or structure. Flocking of birds, schooling of fish, or in physics, crystal structures are what we call a self-organized phenomena. What's cool about self-organization and other emergent phenomena is, again, they arise from the bottom up. There's no central control. Now, if you see a marching band in formation, that's top-down organization. They were all giving marching orders and they go exactly where they go, we're told to go. If you see geese flying in a V, you're seeing a structure that emerged without any sort of top-down organization. You can spend all day in the park and you're never going to see the geese sitting in a little huddle where one person's telling the other geese where to go. It's also the case that water doesn't say, hey, let's all be wet. Your neurons don't have little committee meetings to decide how to remember the quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, the whole thing divided by 2a. Right? There's no meeting that decides that, yet somehow my brain remembers that. It's these emergent phenomena that complex systems can shed light on, and in some cases, we hope anyway, explain. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how complex systems produce something interesting from a dynamic perspective called phase transitions. Now, these are more popularly known as tips or tipping points. Permit me an analogy here and then an example. Imagine I've got a ball in the bottom of one basin of a double basin sink. So I've got a double basin sink here, the ball's in the bottom of one. Now I push that little ball up. Well, what's going to happen is it's going to roll back down into the basin. So suppose I push a little harder. What's going to happen? It's going to roll back down in the basin. Well, let's suppose I give it a really hard push. Well, now it may escape the first basin and roll into the second basin. Now, the speed at which that ball can escape is called the critical threshold, or the escape velocity. The change in where the ball happens to be, the move from one basin to the next, can be thought of as a phase transition. We move from one state to another. Okay, so that was an analogy. Let's get real here for a second. Let's take this analogy and see it in action. Suppose I start with a clean, what they call an oligotrophic lake. So it's a crystal clear blue lake. And I'm going to start dropping some phosphorus into this lake. Right? Maybe it's running off the fertilizer I've used. No big deal. What's going to happen is the ecosystem is just going to respond. The bottom sediments in this lake are going to absorb the increase in phosphorus. Let me drop in a little bit more. Again, no big deal. The lake is still clear. It's just like that ball going to the bottom of the basin. But suppose I drop in a little bit more. All of a sudden, like, boom, I'm going to get this big, murky, eutrophic lake, a green, mess with algae everywhere. Because what's happening is the amount of phosphorus is going to cross this critical threshold. And we're going to get this phase transition from clear blue waters to green and algae-ridden. Let me give another example, and this is a little more subtle. Let's think about increasing spending on education or healthcare, poverty reduction. It could be that we've got tipping points there as well. So it may be that if we spend small amounts of money, we have no effect. And if we spend a little bit more, we also have no effect. But if there's a critical point, if there's a phase transition, it could be the case if we spend a little bit more, suddenly everything will get a lot better. To know if that's true, to know if there is a phase transition or a critical point or a tipping point, what we need to do is we need to do a science of complex systems to understand how these systems work. So a phase transition is what we call a type of nonlinearity. Now recall a linear function is a straight line. So a firm might find, for example, that their market share increases linearly with price decreases. So if they decrease prices by, if they cut prices by 1%, they get a 2% increase in sales. They cut prices by 2%, they get a 4% increase in sales. So in those examples, what you're seeing is a linear response. In the examples we just talked about, the response was nonlinear, right? We got nothing, 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 and then boom. Now there's a problem here. There's a lot of ways to be nonlinear. In fact, John von Neumann once said, the study of nonlinear functions is like the study of non-elephants. What he meant was that there's an infinite number of ways to be nonlinear. It's within that vast space of possibilities that complex systems exist, right? There's all these things that we have to study.